Nancy Wilson stood at her kitchen window, watching autumn leaves dance across her meticulously maintained front yard in suburban Massachusetts. At 68, she had perfected the art of patience, a virtue that had served her well through 43 years of marriage, raising 3 children, and now navigating the complex dynamics of an extended family with in-laws and grandchildren. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. The 3rd Saturday of October was circled in red, James and Melissa's anniversary dinner. Her son and daughter-in-law had been married for 7 years, and family tradition dictated that the entire Wilson clan would gather to celebrate at their home. Nancy frowned. Strange that she hadn't received an invitation yet. James was usually so prompt about these things, a trait he'd inherited from his father, Robert. "Did you check the mail today?" Robert called from the living room, his voice mixing with the low hum of a football game on television. "Yes, nothing but bills and advertisements," Nancy replied, reaching for her phone. She scrolled through her messages. Nothing from James or Melissa. Nancy dialed her son's number, listening to it ring several times before going to voicemail. "Hi, James, it's Mom. Just checking in about your anniversary dinner next weekend. Give me a call when you get a chance. Love you." Later that evening, while preparing dinner, Nancy's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter, Sarah. "Mom, have you started working on your famous apple pie for James and Melissa's dinner? I'm bringing that spinach dip everyone loved last time." Nancy paused, knife hovering over the cutting board. So invitations had gone out. She quickly typed a response. "Looking forward to it, honey. What time did they say it starts?" Sarah's reply came almost immediately. 7, Usao. "Didn't you get the fancy invitation? Melissa sent them out weeks ago, said she was elevating the tradition this year." A familiar tightness formed in Nancy's chest. This wasn't the first time she'd been conveniently forgotten by her daughter-in-law. Over the past few years, Melissa had established a pattern of small exclusions, neighborhood barbecues Nancy learned about through Facebook photos, family brunches she wasn't informed about until the day before, and now this. The next morning, Nancy drove to James and Melissa's house, ostensibly to drop off some gardening tools James had borrowed. As she pulled into their driveway, she spotted Melissa loading shopping bags into her SUV. "Nancy, what a surprise," Melissa said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. At 35, Melissa Sterling Wilson carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling her environment. Her sleek blonde bob and designer casual wear contrasted with Nancy's practical silver curls and comfortable slacks. "Just returning James's pruning shears," Nancy explained, holding up the garden tools. "And I wanted to check if my invitation to your anniversary dinner got lost in the mail." A flicker of something, annoyance, guilt, crossed Melissa's face before her expression smoothed into practiced concern. "Oh, Nancy, I'm positive I sent one to you and Robert. I addressed all the invitations myself." Melissa closed her trunk with unnecessary force. "Maybe it got lost in the mail. You know how unreliable the postal service can be these days." "Maybe," Nancy conceded, though she didn't believe it for a second. "What time should we arrive on Saturday?" "Actually," Melissa hesitated, adjusting her designer sunglasses, "we're keeping it smaller this year, just immediate family. With the house renovations and everything going on at work, we're scaling back." Nancy maintained her composure, decades of social grace coming to her aid. "I see. Well, immediate family includes grandparents, doesn't it? Unless the definition has changed." Before Melissa could respond, the front door opened and James appeared, his expression brightening at the sight of his mother. "Mom, what brings you by?" he asked, coming down the driveway to give her a hug. "Just returning your tools," Nancy said, deciding not to create a scene. "And checking in about your anniversary dinner." James looked confused. "You are coming, right? I told Melissa to make sure you got an invitation." Melissa quickly interjected, "I was just explaining to Nancy that the invitation must have gotten lost in the mail. Such a shame." "Well, no harm done," James said easily. "Mom, we'd love to have you and Dad there, 7 o'clock on Saturday." Nancy nodded, noting how Melissa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. As she drove home, a plan began forming in her mind. She wouldn't confront Melissa or complain to James. That would only create tension and possibly damage her relationship with her son. No, Nancy Wilson had a different approach to handling slights. Instead of anger, she chose creativity. Instead of confrontation, she would orchestrate an elegant response. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Nancy knew exactly what she was going to do. That evening, Nancy sat at her kitchen table with her address book open, making phone calls. She spoke with her daughter Sarah, her younger son Michael, and his wife Diane, her sister Eleanor and brother-in-law Frank, and several close family friends who had always been part of family celebrations. "I'm hosting a special autumn harvest dinner at our home this Saturday," she explained warmly. "Nothing formal, just good food and better company. I'd love for you to come." By the time Robert came in from his workshop in the garage, Nancy had confirmed a dozen guests for Saturday evening. "What's all this?" he asked, noticing the notepad filled with menu ideas and the address book open on the table. Nancy looked up at her husband, a small smile playing on her lips. "We're having a party on Saturday, dear, and I have a feeling it's going to be quite memorable." Robert raised an eyebrow, recognizing the determined glint in his wife's eye. After 4 decades of marriage, he knew that look well. Nancy Wilson had been underestimated, and someone was about to learn a valuable lesson in respect. The following morning, Nancy woke with renewed purpose. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom curtains as she slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Robert, who was still sleeping soundly. She moved through their colonial-style home with quiet determination, the wooden floors creaking gently beneath her slippered feet. In the kitchen, Nancy pulled out her worn leather recipe book, a family heirloom passed down from her mother, and began planning her menu. This wouldn't be just any dinner. It would be a testament to decades of gathering loved ones around her table, to the traditions she had cultivated and the relationships she had nurtured. "You're up early," Robert observed, shuffling into the kitchen in his plaid robe. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Nancy had already prepared. "Already planning Saturday's coup?" Nancy smiled, not looking up from her list. "It's not a coup, Robert. It's simply an alternative. An alternative that happens to be scheduled at exactly the same time as our son's anniversary dinner," he pointed out, the corner of his mouth twitching with amusement. "A coincidence," Nancy replied innocently, though they both knew better. 43 years of marriage had taught Robert to recognize when his wife was orchestrating something. "I'm thinking pot roast as the main course, your favorite." Robert hummed appreciatively. "And will there be those roasted potatoes with the rosemary?" "Of course," Nancy said, adding items to her shopping list. "And that bourbon pecan pie that everyone loves." Robert sat across from her at the kitchen table, watching her work with the precision and focus that had always characterized her approach to family gatherings. "Nancy," he said gently, "have you considered just talking to James about this? Telling him that Melissa deliberately excluded you?" Nancy's pen paused momentarily. "And put him in the middle? Force him to choose sides between his mother and his wife?" She shook her head. "No, Robert, that would only make things worse. So instead, you're going to throw a competing dinner party and hope everyone chooses your table over theirs?" "I'm creating an option," Nancy corrected him. "People will go where they feel welcome. And besides," she added with a small smile, "my pot roast is legendary." Later that morning, Nancy drove to the farmer's market on Main Street. Autumn in New England meant an abundance of seasonal produce, and she carefully selected plump pumpkins, crisp apples, and colorful gourds for her table centerpiece. The market bustled with activity, locals chatting and catching up on community news as they filled their baskets. "Nancy, lovely to see you," called Margaret Peterson, a longtime friend and notorious town gossip. "I'm looking forward to Saturday. It's been too long since we've all gotten together at your place." "Yes, it has," Nancy agreed, selecting a bunch of fresh thyme. "I'm expecting quite a few people." Margaret leaned in conspiratorially. I heard James and Melissa are having their anniversary dinner the same night. Didn't they invite you? Nancy maintained her composure, arranging her face into an expression of mild surprise. Oh, is that this Saturday? I'm sure they're keeping it intimate this year. You know how young couples are these days. Margaret didn't look convinced, but Nancy skillfully redirected the conversation to the Women's Club fundraiser planned for the following month. By the time they parted ways, Margaret seemed to have forgotten about the scheduling conflict, but Nancy knew better. By sunset, half the town would be speculating about the competing events. At the butcher shop, Nancy selected a prime cut of beef for her pot roast. Mr. Daniels, who had been supplying the Wilson family with meat for over 30 years, wrapped it carefully in brown paper. Special occasion? He asked, noting the size of the roast. Just a gathering of friends and family, Nancy replied. Nothing too formal. Well, they're in for a treat. Your pot roast is famous in these parts, Nancy smiled, pleased by the compliment. That's kind of you to say, Joe. I do put a little extra love into it. As she continued her shopping, Nancy ran into Michael's wife, Diane, at the bakery. Diane was selecting pastries at the counter, her 3-year-old daughter, Emma, perched on her hip. Nancy! Diane exclaimed warmly. Emma, say hi to Grandma. The little girl buried her face shyly in her mother's shoulder, then peeked out with a small wave. Hello, my sweet girl, Nancy cooed, reaching out to stroke Emma's soft curls. Are you helping Mommy shop? Diane adjusted Emma on her hip. We're picking up some desserts for Saturday. Michael insists we can't show up empty-handed, even though I told him you probably have everything covered. Your brownies would be wonderful, Nancy suggested. Everyone always raves about them. Consider it done, Diane agreed. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Nancy, about Saturday. It's a bit awkward with James and Melissa's dinner being the same night. Nancy maintained her serene expression. Not at all. Everyone should feel free to go where they'd like. No pressure. Well, that's just it, Diane continued. James called Michael last night, sounding confused. He asked if we were coming to their anniversary dinner, and Michael mentioned your autumn harvest gathering. She shifted Emma to her other hip. Apparently, James had no idea you were hosting something the same night. Nancy absorbed this information with outward calm, though inwardly she felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't intended for James to be caught off guard. I'm sure it will all work out, she said lightly. Family has a way of finding balance. Diane nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. Michael suggested we make an appearance at both events. Early dinner with James and Melissa, then dessert at your place. Would that be okay? Of course, Nancy assured her. Whatever works best for your family. As Nancy continued her errands, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Mum, just got a confused call from James, asking if I'm going to his anniversary dinner or your surprise party. What's going on? Nancy sighed, sitting in her parked car to respond. Not a surprise party, dear, just a gathering. You're welcome at either event, or both if you prefer. Sarah's response was immediate. Mum, are you and Melissa feuding again? No feuding, Nancy typed back. Just a scheduling coincidence. Love you. By the time Nancy returned home, her car laden with groceries, she found Robert in the dining room, polishing their best silverware, a wedding gift they reserved for special occasions. You didn't have to do that, she said, setting her bags on the kitchen counter. I know, he replied, carefully buffing a silver serving spoon. But if we're going to make a statement, we might as well make it shine. Nancy laughed, despite herself. You know me too well. 43 years, Nancy. I ought to by now. Robert set down the polishing cloth. James called while you were out. Nancy paused in unpacking her groceries. What did he say? He wanted to know if we were still coming to his anniversary dinner on Saturday. Robert watched his wife carefully. He sounded confused, said he'd heard rumors about us hosting a competing event. Nancy busied herself arranging vegetables in the refrigerator. And what did you tell him? I told him we had indeed planned a gathering, but it wasn't meant to compete with anything. Robert folded his arms. Nancy, He specifically asked if this had something to do with Melissa not sending us an invitation. Nancy closed the refrigerator door and turned to face her husband. And I told him he should talk to his wife about that. Robert's expression softened. Nancy, I understand why you're doing this, but are you sure this is the best way to handle the situation? Nancy leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly feeling the weight of her actions. What would you have me do, Robert? Confront Melissa directly? Create a scene? Force James to choose sides? She shook her head. No, this way everyone saves face. Melissa gets her intimate dinner, and we create a warm, welcoming alternative for anyone who wishes to join us. Robert crossed the kitchen to stand beside his wife, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I just want to make sure this doesn't backfire, that's all. I don't want to see you hurt, and I don't want to damage our relationship with James. Nancy covered his hand with her own. Trust me, Robert, sometimes the quietest responses speak the loudest. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Nancy wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to answer it. Standing on their front porch was James, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. Mum, he said simply, I think we need to talk. Nancy stood in the doorway, momentarily caught off guard by her son's unexpected visit. James looked tired, the fine lines around his eyes more pronounced than usual. At 41, he had inherited his father's height and broad shoulders, but his serious expression and thoughtful demeanor were all Nancy. James, she said, recovering quickly. What a nice surprise. Come in. She stepped aside to let him enter the familiar foyer of his childhood home. James ran a hand through his dark hair, now flecked with early grey at the temples, as he followed his mother into the living room. Robert looked up from his newspaper, glasses perched low on his nose. James, he said, rising to greet his son with a firm handshake that turned into a brief hug. Didn't expect to see you today. I needed to clear something up, James replied, his tone measured but tense. He turned to Nancy. Mum, what's this I'm hearing about you hosting some kind of dinner party on Saturday night? Nancy gestured for him to sit on the sofa while she took her usual armchair across from him. It's just a small autumn harvest gathering, nothing elaborate. On the same night as our anniversary dinner, James pressed, remaining standing. Mom, half the family's now confused about where they're supposed to be. Sarah called me asking if the plans had changed. Michael and Diane are talking about splitting their evening between two events. What's going on? Nancy smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her slacks. James, did Melissa tell you she sent us an invitation to your anniversary dinner? James blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. Of course she did. She said she mailed them out weeks ago. And did she mention that when I stopped by your house earlier this week, she told me the dinner was being kept small this year? Just immediate family, I believe were her words. James's brow furrowed. What? No, that can't be right. We invited everyone. You, Dad, Sarah, Michael and his family, Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Frank. Well, apparently your wife has a different definition of immediate family than you do, Nancy said quietly. One that doesn't include your parents. Robert cleared his throat. Son, sit down. This isn't a conversation to have standing in the middle of the room. James sank onto the sofa, looking bewildered. There must be some misunderstanding. Melissa wouldn't deliberately exclude you two. Nancy and Robert exchanged a glance. Decades of marriage, allowing them to communicate volumes without words. Robert nodded slightly, giving Nancy the lead. James, she began carefully, this isn't the first time Melissa has overlooked us. Remember the 4th of July barbecue last year? We found out about it when Sarah posted pictures online, or Emma's ballet recital in the spring. We weren't told until the day before, and only because Michael mentioned it assuming we already knew. James's expression shifted from confusion to discomfort. Those were honest mistakes. Melissa gets busy with work, and sometimes details slip through the cracks. Details like inviting your parents to family gatherings? Robert asked gently. James stood up again, pacing the living room as he had done as a teenager when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Look, I know Melissa can be a bit particular about planning events. She likes things a certain way. But she wouldn't deliberately exclude you. Nancy watched her son, recognizing the conflict playing across his face. James, I'm not trying to create problems between you and Melissa. That's precisely why I decided to host my own gathering rather than make an issue of being excluded from yours. But that's exactly what you're doing, James countered, his voice rising slightly. By scheduling a competing event, you're forcing everyone to choose sides. No one is being forced to choose anything, Nancy replied, her tone firm but gentle. People are welcome to attend either event, or both, or neither. I'm simply creating an alternative for anyone who might not have been included in Melissa's vision for your anniversary. James stopped pacing and faced his mother directly. Mom, be honest with me. Do you really believe Melissa would intentionally not invite you and Dad to our anniversary dinner? Nancy met her son's gaze steadily. Yes, James, I do. The living room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from Nancy's parents, now a family heirloom. James sank back onto the sofa, rubbing his forehead. I need to talk to Melissa about this, he said finally. Before you do, Nancy cautioned, think carefully about how you approach it. I'm not telling you this to create conflict in your marriage. I'm telling you because patterns don't usually improve when they go unaddressed. Robert, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. Son, every marriage has its challenges. Your mother and I have had our share, but mutual respect has to be the foundation. James nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. I just don't understand why Melissa would do this. She knows how important family is to me. People have complex reasons for their actions, Nancy said. Maybe she feels threatened by our relationship with you. Maybe she's trying to establish her own traditions. Whatever her reasons, communication is key. James checked his watch and stood up. I have a meeting in half an hour, but I'll talk to Melissa tonight. He hesitated, then asked, What about Saturday? What do you want me to do? Nancy rose and placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. Host your anniversary dinner as planned. Celebrate your marriage. That's what matters. And your harvest dinner? We'll go on as well, Nancy replied with a small smile. Those who wish to join us will be welcome. James hugged his mother, then his father. I'll sort this out, he promised, before heading to the door. After he left, Robert turned to Nancy. Well, that went better than I expected. He's a good man, Nancy said, watching through the window as James's car pulled out of the driveway. He deserves to know the truth. And now comes the hard part, Robert observed, when he confronts Melissa. That's between them, Nancy replied, though concern lined her face. Marriage is a continuous negotiation. They'll have to find their way through this. Across town, in the gleaming kitchen of their renovated Victorian home, Melissa Sterling Wilson was reviewing the catering order for Saturday's dinner when her phone chimed with a text from James. We need to talk tonight. Important. Melissa frowned, her perfectly manicured finger hovering over the screen. Something in the terse message sent a warning signal. She typed back, Everything okay? You sound serious. James's response was immediate. Just spoke with my parents. Found out about Mom's dinner party on Saturday. Melissa set down her phone, a wave of irritation washing over her. Of course, Nancy would run to James with her complaints. The woman simply couldn't respect boundaries. When James arrived home that evening, Melissa had prepared his favorite pasta dish and opened a bottle of Cabernet, a strategic choice for what she anticipated would be a difficult conversation. She greeted him with a kiss, noting the tension in his shoulders. Rough day? She asked, pouring him a glass of wine. James accepted the glass, but didn't drink. We need to talk about the anniversary dinner. Melissa leaned against the kitchen island, her posture casual but defensive. What about it? Everything's arranged. The caterer is confirmed, the house will be cleaned on Friday, and the flowers are ordered. Did you send an invitation to my parents? The directness of the question caught Melissa off guard. She took a sip of wine before answering. Of course I did. I told you I mailed them all out together. James watched her carefully. That's interesting, because my mother says she never received one. And when she asked you about it directly, you told her the dinner was being kept small this year, just immediate family. Melissa set down her glass, her cheeks flushing slightly. James, your mother misunderstood. I simply meant we weren't inviting all those distant cousins and work colleagues like last year. So you did send them an invitation. Melissa hesitated, calculating her response. I addressed one to them, yes. That's not what I asked, James pressed. Did you mail them an invitation? The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, Melissa sighed. No, I didn't. James closed his eyes briefly. Why, Melissa? Why would you deliberately exclude my parents from our anniversary dinner? Melissa's composure cracked slightly. Because every time your mother is involved in any event, it becomes about her. She has to be consulted on the menu. She has opinions about the decor. She expects to help in the kitchen, even when I've hired professional caterers. Her voice rose with each grievance. For once, I wanted to host a dinner where I didn't feel like I was being judged or supervised in my own home. So instead of talking to me about it, you simply decided not to invite them and lied to me about it, James asked, his tone more hurt than angry. Would you have agreed if I had? Melissa challenged. No, probably not, James admitted. But at least we could have discussed it like adults instead of creating this mess. Melissa folded her arms. What mess? Everything was fine until your mother decided to throw a competing dinner party out of spite. She says it's not competing, James countered. It's simply an alternative for people who weren't included in our plans. Oh, please, Melissa scoffed. Nancy is many things, but subtle isn't one of them. This is a deliberate power play. James ran a hand through his hair in frustration. This isn't about power, Melissa. It's about respect. My parents have never been anything but supportive of our relationship. They helped with the down payment on this house. They babysit Emma whenever Michael and Diane need it. They show up for every family event. He set his untouched wine on the counter. And you decided they weren't worth inviting to our anniversary celebration. Melissa's expression softened slightly, recognizing the genuine hurt in her husband's eyes. James, I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth. But you have to understand, your family dynamics are intense. Everyone defers to Nancy. She's the matriarch, the perfect hostess, the one who never forgets a birthday or misses an opportunity to bring everyone together. She took a step closer to him. Do you know how intimidating that is? 7 years of marriage, and I still feel like I'm being measured against her standard. James's anger ebbed slightly as he considered his wife's perspective. Melissa, if you felt that way, you should have talked to me. Would you have heard me? She asked quietly. Really heard me? Or would you have defended your mother, just like you're doing now? The question hung in the air between them, forcing James to examine his own role in the situation. I don't know, he admitted finally, but excluding them and lying to me about it wasn't the solution. Melissa nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. You're right, I handled it poorly. She hesitated, then asked, So what happens now? Your mother is hosting her dinner, we're hosting ours, and the entire family is caught in the middle. James reached for his wineglass, taking a long drink before responding. Now we fix it. Together. How? First, we call my parents and formally invite them to our anniversary dinner, James said firmly. Then we figure out a way to blend the two events so no one has to choose sides. Melissa's eyes widened. You want to combine our carefully planned anniversary dinner with your mother's hastily arranged harvest gathering? I want our family to be whole, James replied simply. And that means finding a compromise that respects everyone involved. Melissa considered this, weighing her pride against the potential consequences of continued conflict. Finally, she nodded. Okay, we'll call your parents, but I'm not canceling the caterer. James smiled for the first time since arriving home. I wouldn't dream of it. My mother's pot roast and your gourmet catering, it'll be an eclectic feast. As James reached for his phone to call his parents, Melissa watched him with a mixture of resignation and respect. She hadn't anticipated this outcome when she'd forgotten to mail the Wilsons' invitation, but perhaps it was time to try a different approach with her mother-in-law. After all, if Nancy Wilson was determined to be a force in their lives, maybe it was better to align with that force rather than resist it. In the Wilson household, Nancy's phone rang as she was preparing a shopping list for Saturday's dinner. When she saw James's name on the caller ID, she exchanged a glance with Robert before answering. "James," she said warmly, "how are you?" "Mom," James replied, his voice steady, "Melissa and I would like to invite you and Dad to our anniversary dinner on Saturday. And we have a proposition we'd like to discuss." Nancy held the phone slightly away from her ear so Robert could hear as well. "A proposition?" she echoed, curiosity mingling with caution in her voice. "Yes," James continued, "we'd like to discuss combining our events this Saturday. Perhaps we could start at our house for dinner and move to yours for dessert and after-dinner drinks. That way no one has to choose, and we can celebrate both our anniversary and your autumn gathering." Nancy caught Robert's eye. He raised his eyebrows slightly and gave a small nod of approval. "That's a thoughtful suggestion, James," Nancy replied carefully. "Let me discuss it with your father and we'll get back to you." "Actually, Mom," James said, his tone shifting to something more determined, "Melissa would like to speak with you directly. Is that okay?" Nancy's grip tightened imperceptibly on the phone. "Of course." There was a brief pause, the sound of the phone changing hands, and then Melissa's voice came through, polished and controlled as always. "Nancy, hello. I want to apologize for the misunderstanding about the invitation. It was never my intention to exclude you and Robert from our celebration." Nancy noted the careful wording, a misunderstanding rather than an admission of deliberate exclusion. But she also recognized an olive branch when it was offered, however begrudgingly. "These things happen," Nancy replied diplomatically. "What matters is finding a solution that works for everyone." "Exactly," Melissa agreed, sounding relieved at Nancy's measured response. "So here's what we're thinking. Our catered dinner at our house at 7, followed by dessert and drinks at your place around 9. That way, everyone can attend both events, and neither of us has to cancel our plans entirely." Nancy considered the proposal. It was a reasonable compromise, and it would spare the family the awkwardness of having to choose between competing events. Still, she wasn't quite ready to completely surrender her position. "That sounds workable," Nancy said. "Though I've already started preparations for a full dinner, perhaps we could reverse the order. Appetizers and drinks at our house, then dinner at yours, followed by dessert back at our place." There was a pause, then Melissa's voice slightly strained. "Nancy, we've already confirmed the catering for 7 o'clock. It would be difficult to reschedule at this point." Nancy smiled to herself, recognizing the negotiation tactic. "I understand. In that case, why don't we keep your dinner as planned, and people can come to our house before or after as they prefer. We'll be serving food throughout the evening, so guests can enjoy whatever timing works best for them." Another pause, longer this time, with muffled voices in the background, suggesting Melissa and James were conferring. Finally, Melissa returned to the phone. "That could work," she conceded. "We'll let everyone know they're welcome at both locations, with the formal anniversary dinner at our house at 7. "Perfect," Nancy said pleasantly. "And Melissa, I look forward to celebrating with you both." After ending the call, Nancy turned to Robert, who had been listening intently to her side of the conversation. "Well?" he asked. "We've reached a compromise," Nancy explained. "Their catered dinner proceeds as planned at 7. Our gathering will be more open-ended, with people welcome before or after their event." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "So, essentially, you both get to host your events, but you've removed the element of competition." "Exactly," Nancy said, returning to her grocery list. "It's not about winning, Robert. It's about maintaining family harmony while still establishing boundaries. And making sure everyone knows that Nancy Wilson can't be casually excluded," Robert added, with a knowing smile. Nancy looked up, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "That's merely a beneficial side effect." The next morning, Nancy was in her garden harvesting the last of the season's herbs when her phone chimed with a message from Sarah. "So apparently we're doing a progressive dinner now. Just got calls from both you and James explaining the new plan. What exactly happened?" Nancy typed back. "Just a simple scheduling adjustment, nothing to worry about." Sarah's response was immediate. "Mom, I know you too well. This has calculated Nancy written all over it. Did Melissa really try to exclude you from their dinner?" "Water under the bridge now," Nancy replied. "Looking forward to seeing you Saturday." She tucked her phone away and continued gathering rosemary and thyme, the fragrant herbs releasing their scent into the crisp autumn air. The garden had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could work through her thoughts while nurturing living things. Much like family relationships, gardens required regular attention, occasional pruning, and the wisdom to know when to intervene and when to let nature take its course. Later that afternoon, as Nancy was arranging flowers for her table centerpiece, the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it, surprised to find Melissa standing on her porch, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Melissa," Nancy said, masking her surprise, "this is unexpected." Melissa shifted uncomfortably, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Is this a good time?" "Of course," Nancy replied, stepping aside to let her in. "I was just arranging some flowers for Saturday. Would you like some tea?" Melissa nodded, following Nancy into the kitchen where autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the warm, lived-in space. Unlike Melissa's sleek, magazine-worthy kitchen with its marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances, Nancy's kitchen told the story of a family's life: children's artwork magnetized to the refrigerator, well-worn cookbooks lining open shelves, and the comforting scent of home-baked bread lingering in the air. Nancy filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then turned to face her daughter-in-law. "What brings you by, Melissa?" Melissa placed her handbag carefully on a kitchen chair, then squared her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "I wanted to talk to you directly without James as an intermediary." Nancy nodded, appreciating the directness. "I'm listening." "First, I want to apologize," Melissa began, her words measured and rehearsed. "Not including you and Robert in our anniversary dinner was inconsiderate. James was very upset when he found out, and rightfully so." Nancy noted that it still wasn't a full admission of deliberate exclusion, but it was progress. "Thank you for saying that. Apology accepted." Melissa seemed surprised by the easy acceptance, having clearly braced for more resistance. The kettle whistled, giving her a moment to collect herself as Nancy prepared 2 cups of Earl Grey tea, setting one before Melissa along with a small plate of homemade shortbread cookies. "These look delicious," Melissa commented, taking a cookie. "Family recipe," Nancy replied. "James always loved them as a boy." A flicker of something, irritation, insecurity, crossed Melissa's face at the reminder of Nancy's long history with James. She sipped her tea, then set the cup down decisively. "Nancy, I need to be honest with you. Sometimes I feel overshadowed by you in this family." Nancy tilted her head slightly. "Overshadowed? You're the perfect mother, the perfect hostess, the family matriarch who holds everyone together," Melissa explained, her composure cracking slightly to reveal genuine emotion. "Every holiday, every birthday, every family milestone, you're at the center of it all. And I feel like I'm constantly being measured against your standard and coming up short." Nancy listened carefully, seeing her daughter-in-law perhaps for the first time as a woman struggling to find her place in an established family system rather than as an adversary. "Melissa, I had no idea you felt that way," Nancy said gently. "I've never intended to overshadow you, especially not in your role as James's wife or as a hostess in your own home." "I know that intellectually," Melissa admitted, "but emotionally it's difficult. James talks about your Sunday dinners and holiday traditions with such reverence. Everyone compares my cooking to yours, my decorating to yours. Even my mother-in-law skills are measured against how you raised your children." She looked down at her teacup. "I just wanted one event where I could be in control, where I could establish my own tradition without feeling like I was competing with you. Nancy absorbed this revelation, recognizing the kernel of truth within it. Perhaps she had held on too tightly to her role as the family's central figure, making it difficult for newcomers, particularly someone as naturally independent as Melissa, to carve out their own place. "I understand," Nancy said finally, "and I appreciate your honesty. Family dynamics are complicated, especially when new members join through marriage." Melissa looked up, surprised by Nancy's receptiveness. "So, you're not offended by your feelings?" "No," Nancy assured her, "though I do wish you had spoken to me directly rather than excluding us from the dinner." Melissa had the grace to look embarrassed. "That was childish, I know. I just didn't know how to have this conversation." "Well, we're having it now," Nancy pointed out with a small smile. "That's a start." They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing slightly as they sipped their tea. Finally, Nancy spoke again. "Melissa, I think we need to acknowledge that we're very different women with different approaches to family and entertaining. That's not inherently good or bad. It's just reality." Melissa nodded cautiously. "I agree, but we both love James," Nancy continued, "and for his sake, if nothing else, we need to find a way to respect each other's territories and styles." "What are you suggesting?" Nancy considered her next words carefully. "Perhaps we could establish clearer boundaries around family events. You and James should absolutely have the space to create your own traditions, particularly for occasions like your anniversary, and I should be more mindful about stepping back and allowing you to take the lead in your home." "I'd appreciate that," Melissa said softly. "In return," Nancy added, "I'd ask that you communicate openly with me when you're feeling overshadowed or pushed aside. No more lost invitations or convenient misunderstandings. Deal?" Melissa smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for perhaps the first time in Nancy's presence. "Deal." They clinked teacups in a gesture of tentative peace. "Now," Nancy said, her tone lightening, "about Saturday. I think our compromise is a good one, but I want to make sure we're aligned on the messaging to the family. No one should feel they're caught in the middle of tension between us." Melissa nodded in agreement. "I've already texted Sarah and Michael to clarify that both events are happening with our mutual blessing. And I mentioned to my parents that we'll be starting at our house but moving to yours later in the evening." "Perfect," Nancy said approvingly. "That's exactly the right approach." "Ok." As they continued discussing the logistics of their now complementary events, Nancy found herself revising her opinion of her daughter-in-law. Behind Melissa's polished exterior and sometimes prickly defenses was a woman who cared deeply about her place in the family and who, like Nancy herself, wanted to be respected and valued for her contributions. When Melissa eventually rose to leave, their conversation had covered not just Saturday's arrangements, but also tentative plans for Thanksgiving, to be held at James and Melissa's house with specific dishes delegated to various family members, and Christmas, divided between both homes with clear delineation of responsibilities. At the front door, Melissa hesitated, then asked, "Nancy, I'm curious. What were you planning to serve on Saturday before all this happened?" "Pot roast," Nancy replied with a small smile. "James's favorite." Melissa laughed softly. "Of course. Well, now you can still serve it, just a bit later in the evening. And I promise our catered dinner won't include pot roast. We wouldn't want to compete." "I appreciate that," Nancy said. "And Melissa, thank you for coming by today. It took courage." Melissa nodded, a new understanding passing between them. "See you Saturday." As Nancy watched her daughter-in-law walk to her car, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The situation hadn't resolved exactly as she'd planned when she first decided to host her competing dinner party. But perhaps this outcome was better, a genuine step toward mutual respect rather than a mere power play. When Robert returned home from his golf game an hour later, he found Nancy humming contentedly as she worked on her centerpiece. "You're in a good mood," he observed. "Did something happen?" Nancy arranged a vibrant orange maple leaf among the chrysanthemums and gourds. Melissa stopped by. Robert's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Voluntarily? Without James?" Nancy confirmed. We had quite an illuminating conversation. Should I be concerned? Robert asked, only half joking. Nancy smiled enigmatically. Not at all. I think we've reached an understanding. Care to elaborate? Let's just say we've established some ground rules for peaceful coexistence. Nancy stepped back to admire her handiwork. What do you think of the centerpiece? Robert recognized the deflection but decided not to press. After 43 years, he knew when his wife was processing a significant interaction. It's beautiful, he said sincerely. The colors are perfect for autumn. Nancy nodded, satisfied. I think Saturday is going to go very well, Robert. Better than I initially planned. You mean your scheme to teach Melissa a lesson through a competing dinner party? Nancy shot him a mock-stern look. I prefer to think of it as creating an opportunity for growth and communication. Robert chuckled, wrapping an arm around his wife's shoulders. Nancy Wilson, you never cease to amaze me. Somehow you've turned a family conflict into a diplomatic summit with a progressive dinner as the peace treaty. Nancy leaned into his embrace, smiling. Sometimes the most effective revolutions are the quiet ones, dear. No shots fired, just boundaries established and respect earned. As they stood together admiring the centerpiece that would grace their table on Saturday evening, Nancy felt a sense of contentment settle over her. The path forward with Melissa wouldn't always be smooth. They were too different, too strong-willed for that. But they had taken an important first step toward genuine family harmony. And that, Nancy reflected, was worth far more than winning any single battle. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that seemed custom-ordered for special occasions. Crisp, clear air filled with the scent of fallen leaves, and a sky so vividly blue it appeared painted rather than real. Nancy rose early, moving through her morning routine with practiced efficiency while mentally reviewing her preparations for the evening. By noon, her kitchen was a hub of coordinated activity. The pot roast, seasoned with herbs from her garden, sat ready to go into the oven at precisely the right time. Vegetables were chopped, pies were cooling on the windowsill, and Robert was tasked with transforming their dining room into an autumnal haven with candles, string lights, and the centerpiece Nancy had perfected days earlier. How are we doing on time? Robert called from the dining room, where he was arranging chairs to accommodate their expected guests. Right on schedule, Nancy replied, checking her handwritten timeline. The roast goes in at 3, Sarah's bringing her spinach dip at 5, and guests should start arriving around 6 for pre-dinner drinks before heading to James and Melissa's. Robert appeared in the kitchen doorway, a twinkle in his eye. And then they'll all return here around 9 for dessert and after-dinner drinks, having discovered that Melissa's catered affair, while undoubtedly elegant, lacks the warmth and personal touch of your cooking. Nancy shot him a reproving look, though her lips twitched with amusement. That's not the goal, Robert. Remember our conversation with Melissa. This isn't a competition. Of course not, Robert agreed, his tone innocent. Just an observation. Nancy shook her head fondly as she returned to her preparations. The truth was, she had approached this evening with a new perspective, following her heart-to-heart with Melissa. This wasn't about proving her superiority as a hostess or asserting her position as family matriarch. It was about creating a complementary experience that honored both women's strengths and styles. At 4:30, the phone rang. Nancy wiped her hands on her apron before answering. Mom. It was Michael, his voice tight with the particular strain of a parent dealing with a sick child. We've got a situation here. Emma woke up from her nap with a fever, and Diane thinks it might be that virus that's been going around her preschool. Nancy's heart sank. Oh no, poor little thing. How high is her fever? 101.2, Michael replied. Not emergency room high, but definitely stay home high. Diane says to tell you she's devastated about missing tonight. Don't give it another thought, Nancy assured him. Emma needs her parents. Is there anything we can do to help? Actually, Michael hesitated, Diane was wondering if you might be willing to pack up some of your pot roast for us. She was really looking forward to it, and neither of us is up for cooking tonight. Nancy smiled, already mentally rearranging her dinner portions. Of course. I'll put together a care package with plenty of food for all three of you. Robert can drop it off on his way to pick up the extra ice." After hanging up, Nancy relayed the news to Robert, who nodded sympathetically. Poor Emma, and poor Michael and Diane. They were looking forward to a night out. Family first, Nancy said simply. Besides, they'll have plenty of opportunities to enjoy your company. Right now, I need to call Sarah and ask her to bring extra wine, since Michael and Diane won't be contributing their bottles. The afternoon proceeded smoothly, the house gradually filling with delicious aromas as Nancy's pot roast slowly cooked to perfection. At 5:30, with most of the preparations complete, Nancy took a moment to change into her chosen outfit for the evening, a flattering burgundy dress that complemented the autumn theme without appearing too formal. As she fastened a simple pearl necklace that had been Robert's gift on their 30th anniversary, she heard the doorbell ring, followed by Sarah's distinctive voice greeting her father. "Mom?" Sarah called up the stairs. "I brought the dip and extra wine as requested." "Be right down," Nancy replied, giving herself a final glance in the mirror. At 68, she was comfortable with the lines that mapped her life's experiences across her face. Tonight, with her silver hair styled in soft waves and a touch of rose lipstick brightening her features, she felt confident and at peace. When she descended the stairs, she found Sarah arranging her famous spinach dip on the kitchen counter. At 39, Sarah was the image of Nancy in her younger years, the same determined chin, the same observant eyes that missed little. "Mom, you look gorgeous," Sarah said, pausing to give her mother a hug. "That color is perfect on you." "Thank you, dear," Nancy replied, returning the embrace before stepping back to admire her daughter's elegant black pantsuit. "You look lovely yourself." "No date tonight?" Sarah shrugged. "Taking a break from the dating scene for a while. After that disaster with William, I'm enjoying my own company." She glanced around the kitchen, noting the multiple dishes in various stages of preparation. "This looks amazing. How are you feeling about the whole evening? Any lingering tension with Melissa?" Nancy began transferring warm appetizers to a serving platter. "Actually, Melissa and I have reached something of an understanding. She stopped by earlier this week and we had a good talk." Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Voluntarily? Without James forcing her?" "People can surprise you," Nancy said mildly. "Sometimes what looks like antagonism is really just insecurity." Sarah looked skeptical. "If you say so, but I've seen how she treats you, Mom. The subtle digs, the forgetting to include you in things." "We've addressed that," Nancy assured her. "I think tonight will go smoothly." Before Sarah could respond, the doorbell rang again. Robert's voice floated in from the hallway as he greeted Eleanor and Frank, Nancy's sister and brother-in-law, who had driven in from Connecticut for the occasion. The house quickly filled with the warm buzz of conversation as early guests arrived for pre-dinner drinks. Nancy moved through her home with the practiced grace of a seasoned hostess, topping up wine glasses, offering appetizers, and ensuring everyone felt welcomed and included. At 6:45, James arrived, looking handsome in a charcoal suit and blue tie. "Mom, everything looks and smells amazing," he said, kissing Nancy's cheek. "Melissa's just finishing up at home. The caterers arrived a bit late, so she sent me ahead to let everyone know we should plan to head over around 7:15 instead of 7. Nancy nodded, unconcerned by the small delay. "Not a problem. We're having a lovely time here. More appetizers, anyone?" "Ash," she called to the gathering in the living room, where Robert was regaling their guests with the story of his disastrous attempt to install a smart home system the previous month. James pulled Nancy aside, lowering his voice. "Mom, I just wanted to say thank you for how you've handled all this. Melissa told me about your conversation and, well, it means a lot to me that you two are trying to work things out." Nancy squeezed her son's hand. "Family is worth the effort, James. Always." At 7:20, the group began gathering coats and purses, preparing to make the short drive to James and Melissa's house for the catered dinner. Nancy surveyed her home with satisfaction. The appetizers had been enthusiastically received, the atmosphere was festive but relaxed, and most importantly, there was no undercurrent of tension or competition. As she and Robert prepared to lock up and join the caravan to James and Melissa's, Nancy's phone chimed with a text. It was from Melissa. "Everything looks perfect here. Thank you for making this work. See you soon." Nancy smiled, showing the message to Robert. "See? Progress." Robert tucked Nancy's hand into the crook of his arm as they walked to their car. "You know what they say. A family that can survive 2 parties in one night can survive anything." Nancy laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "Robert Wilson, you just made that up." "Maybe," he admitted with a grin. "But it sounds wise, doesn't it?" As they drove through the familiar streets of their town toward their son's home, Nancy reflected on how differently the evening was unfolding from what she had initially envisioned when she'd first learned of her exclusion from the anniversary dinner. Instead of a strategic countermove in a family power struggle, the night had evolved into something more meaningful, a genuine attempt at bridging differences and establishing mutual respect. When they pulled into James and Melissa's driveway, they could see the house aglow with warm light, elegant table settings visible through the dining room windows, and Melissa herself standing in the open doorway, welcoming guests with a smile that, for once, seemed entirely genuine. "Ready?" Robert asked, turning off the engine. Nancy nodded, gathering her purse and the bottle of champagne they'd brought as a gift. "Ready." Together they walked toward the light, toward family, toward a new chapter in their shared story. The transition between the two events unfolded more seamlessly than anyone might have expected. Melissa's catered dinner had been elegant and sophisticated, a testament to her impeccable taste with its perfectly plated courses, professional service, and artful presentation. The anniversary celebration had honored James and Melissa's 7 years together with heartfelt toasts and the sharing of memories, all within the stylish ambiance of their renovated Victorian home. As 9 o'clock approached, guests began gathering their belongings, preparing for the short journey back to the Wilson residence for the evening's second act. Nancy and Robert had slipped out a few minutes early to ensure everything was ready at their home. "Do you think people will still have appetite for dessert after that meal?" Robert asked, as he helped Nancy light the candles scattered throughout their living and dining rooms. "There's always room for dessert," Nancy replied confidently, adjusting the bourbon pecan pie on its crystal stand, "especially homemade dessert." The sound of cars pulling into their driveway signaled the arrival of their guests. Nancy took a final glance around the room, satisfied with the warm, inviting atmosphere they had created. The lighting was soft and golden, casting a flattering glow over the autumn decorations. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of cinnamon and apples perfumed the air. The front door opened as Robert welcomed the first arrivals, Sarah and Eleanor, chatting animatedly about Eleanor's recent trip to Italy. They were followed by Frank and 2 couples who were longtime family friends, all exclaiming appreciatively at the transformation of the Wilson home into an autumnal haven. Nancy moved among them, offering coffee, tea, or after-dinner drinks, as everyone settled into the comfortable familiarity of the living room. There was a relaxed quality to the gathering now, the formality of the anniversary dinner giving way to the cozier, more intimate atmosphere of the Wilson home. When James and Melissa arrived, Nancy noticed something different in her daughter-in-law's demeanor. The usual guardedness was absent, replaced by a more natural ease, as Melissa complimented Nancy on the beautiful setting. "Your home looks magical," Melissa said, accepting a glass of dessert wine. "I've always admired how you create such a warm atmosphere." Thank you," Nancy replied, genuinely touched by the compliment. "And dinner at your place was wonderful, so elegant and perfectly executed." Melissa smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Different styles, but both effective in their own way. "Exactly," Nancy agreed, sensing that they had reached a new understanding. That's what makes family gatherings special, the blend of different approaches and traditions. As the evening progressed, the gathering naturally separated into small, shifting groups. the men discussing the latest football scores near the fireplace, Sarah and Melissa comparing notes on a new restaurant in town, Eleanor showing photos from her Italian vacation on her tablet. Nancy moved between these clusters, refreshing drinks and offering desserts, her heart full as she observed the easy harmony that had developed. Robert caught her eye across the room and raised his glass in a subtle toast. Nancy returned the gesture, acknowledging their shared satisfaction in how the evening had unfolded. Around 10:30, as the party was in full swing, Nancy's phone chimed with a text from Diane. "Emma's fever is down, and she's sleeping peacefully. The pot roast was amazing. Michael says it's the best medicine. Thank you for the care package." Nancy showed the message to James and Melissa, who had been concerned about their niece. "That's a relief," James said. "We should drop by tomorrow with that stuffed elephant Emma's been eyeing. Nothing cheers her up like a new, stuffed animal." "I actually picked one up last week," Melissa mentioned. "It's wrapped and ready to go. I'll add some books too. Reading always distracted you when you were sick," she added, glancing at James with affection. Nancy observed this exchange with quiet pleasure, noting how Melissa had remembered this detail about her son. Perhaps there was more common ground between them than she had realized. As the clock approached midnight, the gathering began to naturally wind down. Guests departed in twos and threes, expressing their appreciation for the wonderful evening and the unique two-part celebration. "Best anniversary dinner ever," Sarah declared as she hugged her parents goodbye. "Though I'm not sure how you'll top this next year." "Next year we'll keep it simple," James said, his arm around Melissa's waist. "Maybe just one location." "Actually," Melissa interjected, surprising everyone, "I was thinking maybe we could make this progressive dinner idea a tradition. Start at one house, finish at another." It worked really well. Nancy exchanged a glance with Robert, both of them recognizing the significance of Melissa's suggestion. An olive branch, an acknowledgement that there was room in their family for both women's hosting styles. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Nancy agreed. "We could alternate who hosts which portion each year." Perfect," Melissa nodded, a new warmth in her expression as she met Nancy's gaze. "It's settled then." After the last guests had departed, and James and Melissa had said their goodbyes with promises to call the next day, Nancy and Robert found themselves alone in their living room, surrounded by the pleasant aftermath of a successful gathering. Empty dessert plates, half-filled coffee cups, and the lingering warmth of shared conversation. "Well," Robert said, loosening his tie and sinking onto the sofa, "I'd say that was a resounding success." Nancy began gathering plates, a contented smile playing on her lips. "It really was. Your plan worked, though not exactly as you initially intended," Robert observed, rising to help with the cleanup. Nancy paused, considering his words. "No, it worked out better than I planned. This wasn't about winning or teaching Melissa a lesson. It was about finding a balance, establishing mutual respect. And that pot roast didn't hurt your case," Robert added with a wink. "The pot roast was just a pot roast," Nancy replied modestly, though they both knew it had been exceptional. "What matters is that James is happy, the family remained unified, and Melissa and I have reached an understanding." As they moved around the kitchen together, falling into the comfortable rhythm of 4 decades of partnership, Nancy reflected on the journey of the past week. What had begun as a hurtful exclusion had transformed into an opportunity for growth and communication. She had learned something valuable about Melissa, that beneath the polished exterior and sometimes prickly defenses was a woman who, like Nancy herself, wanted to be valued and respected for her contributions to the family. "Penny for your thoughts," Robert said, loading the dishwasher with practiced efficiency. "I was just thinking about how family dynamics evolve," Nancy replied. "When the children were young, it was simpler in many ways. Robert and Nancy's rules, Robert and Nancy's house, Robert and Nancy's decisions. The benevolent dictatorship phase," Robert quipped. Nancy smiled, handing him a serving platter to rinse. "Exactly. But as they grew up, got married, started their own lives, the dynamic had to change. I think I've been slow to recognize that." "Oh, you've always been the heart of this family, Nancy," Robert said gently. "That's not something you need to apologize for." "No, but I can make room for others to share that role," she acknowledged. "Melissa helped me see that tonight." Later, as they prepared for bed, Nancy paused at their bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street, lined with maple trees now shedding their brilliant autumn leaves. The moon cast a silver glow over the familiar landscape, and in the distance she could just make out the outline of James and Melissa's house, where lights still burned in the upstairs windows. "What a view," Robert remarked, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," Nancy agreed, though she was seeing beyond the physical landscape to the invisible threads that connected these homes, these lives, these generations. "I've been thinking about what to get Melissa for Christmas." Robert raised an eyebrow. "It's only October." "I know, but I have an idea," Nancy explained. "My mother's recipe book, the original one with all her handwritten notes. I think it's time to pass it on." Robert looked surprised. "You've always said that would go to Sarah." "Sarah can have it after Melissa," Nancy decided. "Right now, I think Melissa needs it more, not just for the recipes, but for what it represents. Continuity, acceptance, family." Robert wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Nancy Wilson, you continue to amaze me. After 43 years, you still find ways to surprise me with your grace." Nancy leaned into his embrace, feeling the rightness of her decision. The recipe book was more than a collection of instructions for pot roast and pecan pie. It was a tangible symbol of her willingness to share the matriarchal role she had occupied for so long. As they turned away from the window and prepared for sleep, Nancy felt a deep sense of contentment. The dinner invitation that never arrived had set in motion a chain of events that, while uncomfortable at times, had ultimately strengthened their family bonds. Sometimes, she reflected, the most meaningful gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. In the quiet of their bedroom, with Robert already drifting to sleep beside her, Nancy made a mental note to call Melissa the next day, not to discuss the party or to continue their negotiation of family roles, but simply to check in, one woman to another, one central figure in James's life to another. After all, Nancy thought as sleep began to claim her, families are built not just through the grand gestures and milestone celebrations, but through countless small moments of reaching across divides, of choosing connection over conflict, of making room at the table for all.